Hey friend, welcome back to Acre Homestead. It has been a long time since we have been together. It's been a crazy 10 days since baby was born, and we are going to get into the birth story today, and I'm really excited to share that with you. The birth story, birth and delivery is going to be one episode or one vlog or one sit down and chat. And then we are going to do a postpartum / rehospitalization story, and that's going to be part 2. It's been a wild ride. I'm going to be honest, vulnerable, and I'm going to share the nitty-gritty. And so if you're interested in all of that birth stuff, then hang out with me, grab a cup of coffee, and we're going to sit down and chat. Or you can grab yourself a cup of tea. I've got my tea in my battery-powered mug so that it'll stay warm the whole time we sit down and hang out together. I have 4 pages of notes because it's been a while since all of this transpired, and there was a lot that happened, and so I want to be able to kind of remember those big bullet points. Josh and I sat down and we kind of went through the whole thing this morning so that I could remember kind of everything that went along. So right now we're going to go into the labor and delivery. That's what we're going to talk about right now. And I want to go over, before we get into that, what my birth plan was. I did bring a birth plan to the hospital. I got to go grab it. I kept my birth plan very simple and straightforward. It's just bullet points here. There weren't any big explanations. I had watched a reel from a labor and delivery nurse who had recommended when you do your birth plan, if you just keep it nice and simple, the hospital can keep it in your room, and everyone who comes in can look at it and kind of go over it and know exactly kind of what your preferences are. So let's go over this real quick. So we have the foundation of what my expectations were going into labor and delivery. So birth plan, big bold letters. The top thing I put on here was healthy baby, healthy mama. That was my number 1 priority. I wanted to get out of there healthy and not traumatized. And then the second point I put was informed consent is super important to me. Going into this, I was very nervous about it, and talking with my OB throughout the whole entire pregnancy, she was huge. One of her big things is informed consent. And if you feel like you're in control making decisions, even if sometimes they're scary decisions, then you will feel more empowered, and that things aren't happening to you, but you are part of the decision-making process, even if some things are out of your control. And we'll get into that more as the story progresses. So my first goal was to labor at home as long as possible. First time going into birth, I know that labor can be a really long process, and the more I'm at home, the more comfortable I'll be in my own environment, the less time we spend at the hospital, the better mental game. I think that was the plan. So the plan was to labor at home as long as possible with Josh and be in communication with our doula. And then the next thing I talk about on the birth plan is the ambiance of the room. I wanted it dark. I wanted Christmas lights. I wanted it extremely quiet. And then I put instrumental music. The next thing we talk on the birth plan was pain management. And in my pain management plan, I put movement, heat packs, counter pressure, nitrous oxide, epidural, and hot compresses. The next bullet point I put on where I did not want constant fetal monitoring until and if I got an epidural. I was okay with an IV being placed right away, because if I wanted an epidural when I wanted it, I didn't want the nurses to have to fiddle around with getting an IV in. So I knew that as soon as I got to the hospital, I was okay with them putting an IV in. And then I wanted to limit cervical checks. And then my postpartum, or as soon as baby was born, my birth plan was I wanted skin to skin, delayed cord clamping, and then we had made decisions for baby whether we were going to do the hepatitis B vaccine, the vitamin K shot, and the eye ointment, the erythromycin eye ointment. We made decisions on that, whether we were going to do those or not. Those are something you need to decide. I'm not going to get into that because I know that some of that stuff can be controversial, but I put those on my birth plan so that everybody in the room, as soon as baby was born, they knew exactly what our preferences were on that. So pretty straightforward. That was the birth plan. So let's get into the actual birth and labor and delivery, and we'll see, did everything go according to my plan? My plan was pretty open-ended. I didn't want to have super huge expectations on myself. I was okay if I needed a C-section. Obviously that was not something that I would want, but I was okay if that ended up needing to be the case, and I was okay if I needed to be induced, but that was like on the very bottom. I really did not want to have to do an induction, but I was open to whatever this birth was gonna look like. So I had my 40-week, I was 39 weeks and 6 days appointment. I went into my OB, they checked me. My doctor had offered to do a cervical check at that time if I wanted one, and she said she had prepared me with the weeks leading up to it, that at that appointment, because I would be 39 weeks and 6 days, if I wanted to have a cervical check, I could, but didn't have to, and I could also have my membrane swept if I wanted to. And I went back and forth whether that was something I wanted to do. Going into that appointment, I had decided that I was not going to do a cervical check and I wasn't going to do membrane sweep. But as I was sitting there, because she was actually on call that day working in the hospital and helping deliver babies, I sat there for about 20 minutes and I was thinking that I would prefer baby's birthday to be closer the beginning of December than later and into December. And I thought, you know what, I might as well do everything I can right now to make this labor happen spontaneously, if at all possible. So as I was sitting there, I changed my mind. I called Josh and we had decided that we weren't gonna do a cervical check and we weren't gonna do membrane sweeps. But I thought, you know what, at least I'm gonna try everything I can to have this happen naturally. So when she came into the room, I had already told the MA that I wasn't gonna do it, but then I talked to my OB and we decided to go ahead and do it, and we did. And that was on a Thursday. And the symptoms of that are cramping and a little bit of spotting, and that's what I was experiencing on that Thursday. On that Thursday is when you and I, we hung out together, we packed our hospital bag, we got everything ready in the house. And on the next day, my goal was to pick up an Azure order and to do a little bit of grocery shopping so that I had some fresh fruits and veggies in the house if I went into labor. To be completely honest with you, I did not think that membrane sweep was gonna work, because if you read online about membrane sweeping, swept, I don't know how you say that, that it kind of, they say that, you know, people go into labor usually 24 to 48 hours if it's gonna work after that, but you're already farther along in the process of pregnancy, and so if your body's already ready to go into labor, it will go into labor after a membrane sweep. But in my head, I thought, that's not gonna work for me. I don't think that anything's gonna happen. So I came home that afternoon, I did feel some cramping, I did have a little bit of spotting, and overall I was feeling pretty good. But we had together packed the hospital bag. Josh had packed his bag that night. I had gotten the house completely clean, and Josh and I were talking and we're like, well, you know, I guess if this baby is gonna come, we are ready. Like, we are officially ready, except for the fact that I wanted to pick up my Azure order the next day, and I really wanted to go get some fresh fruits and vegetables in my house. And so we just hung out, we relaxed on Thursday night, and I was feeling cramping and I was spotting, but I still, like I said, I didn't think anything of it. At around 3:30 a.m., I noticed I was waking up and I was feeling cramping right in the front. All the cramping I had during this whole entire process was just right here in the front. And they were pretty uncomfortable, but it just felt like menstrual cramps. I didn't feel like anything more than that. And they were happening about every 20 minutes. And I don't know when, but at some point Josh was catching on that I was very uncomfortable and kind of like waking up and getting a little bit like kind of could tell that I was uncomfortable, and he started tracking them. And it kind of annoyed me actually, because I wanted him to rest. I didn't think that anything serious was happening. Up until this point, I had no Braxton Hicks. I had no contractions. I hadn't felt anything. So that's why I didn't think the membrane sweep was going to happen. Oh, and a note, when she did the membrane sweep, she could barely do it. You have to be 1 centimeter dilated in order to do it. And she said I was a really tight one. So it was something that was kind of borderline whether she was even going to be able to do it on that Thursday. Anyway, and that was another reason why I thought that this wasn't going to happen. So around 3:30, contractions started. And when Josh woke up, I'm not exactly sure what time he woke up. I think it was around 3:30. He started timing them and they were about 20 minutes apart. And I was trying to be really quiet. I was trying to be really still because I wanted him to rest as long as possible. If we were going into labor, I wanted him to be rested so he would be able to support me when we actually needed to go to the hospital. Throughout that night, I was having contractions, and around 5 a.m. I was getting pretty uncomfortable. I didn't really want to stay in bed. I knew that I was disrupting Josh. So I got out of bed and I came and laid on the couch, and I was having contractions on the couch. And at that point, they were about every 5 minutes, and they definitely were getting more intense. Definitely was not able to talk through them, was having to focus, was having to breathe, was having to really concentrate on what was happening, and it was getting pretty uncomfortable. Josh got up and started tracking the contractions again, and I don't know why, but it kind of annoyed me because I was thinking, this isn't real, nothing's happening anytime soon, you don't need to be tracking them. But he was pretty persistent on doing that. And I was getting to the point where I couldn't hide the fact that I was having contractions, so it's pretty obvious that he was, when he was able to track them. At that point, they went from 20 minutes apart to 10 to 15 minutes apart, and Josh was feeling like we were probably going to be going to the hospital this morning. So what he was doing while I was contracting was he took a shower, he got the dogs ready, and he made sure that he had the bags in the car, and the car seat was in the car, and he wanted to check off all those boxes, and he had everything set. So by 8:30, my contractions are about 4 minutes apart, and they're getting more intense, and he is telling me we're going to the hospital, and I'm saying no, we're not. And I come in here, I try to unload the dishwasher, and I'm thinking, if we're going to the hospital, I don't want to come home to dirty dishes in my sink. So between contractions, I'm trying to unload the dishwasher. That doesn't work very well. He's still getting things ready. I ask him to make the bed, and then I tell him I'm not going to the hospital without taking a shower. So at that point, everything is ready to go. He has the car packed, he has the dogs packed, and I'm just being a little bit stubborn. And I just don't want to get to the hospital too soon because I don't want them to turn me away. That's another thing I'm thinking. And I'm thinking, I haven't been in labor that long. I'm a first-time mom. I need to be at home longer. That's just what's going through my head. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's kind of what's going through my head. So I realize I can't unload the dishwasher, but I'm gonna go shower because I'm not going to the hospital without showering. So I get in the shower, and that feels wonderful. And I'm contracting. The contractions are extremely intense at this point, cannot talk, very focused throughout them, I'm in a lot of pain. And at this point, for some reason, I really wanted to be by myself. I was in so much discomfort, and the unknown was happening that I really felt like I just wanted to be by myself. So when Josh was getting things ready in one room, I would go into the other room and kind of labor by myself. And then getting in the shower and just being in the shower in the dark felt really good and really safe. And I guess I said at one point to Josh, like, I just want to have the baby at home. I don't want to go to the hospital. We're just going to have it right here. I would rather just have the baby right here. And in Josh's mind, he's like, no, that's not happening. We're going to the hospital. And he realized, talking later, he's like, I probably should have done a little more research just in case we had the baby at home on what I should do just in case, because that has happened to a family member of ours where they had the baby so quick. It happened on their dining room floor. And so he, at that moment, was thinking, we need to get to the hospital, and I was kind of stubborn. But I realized after getting out of the shower that, yes, we need to go to the hospital. So we left our house by 9 a.m., and we went and dropped the dogs off at the dog sitters, and so they were well taken care of. So we are on the way to the hospital, and one thing that I had requested of Josh is that we do not share with friends and family that I'm in labor. I did not want the pressure of Josh needing to feel like he needed to update family and friends on how I was doing, and I didn't want people texting Josh and distracting him from being my support system. So that was something that I'm glad we had talked about before, that it was just going to be him and I in this, and as long as it didn't take a few days, that we were the only ones that were going to know that this was happening. And then as soon as baby arrived, we could announce that baby was here. The only two people that knew that I was in labor was our Azure Standard pickup coordinator, because I was supposed to pick up our Azure Standard pickup that day, and Josh had to text her and say, I'm sorry, we're at the hospital. She was fabulous. She brought all my stuff home, and once we were out of the hospital, Josh was able to go pick it up, and our dog sitter knew that I was in labor. So those were the only two people that knew, and we were on the way to the hospital. We got to the hospital triage by 10 a.m. so it was a little bit of a drive between our home, dropping the dogs off, and getting to the hospital. And that was a very long car ride. It's so interesting. I remember when I was in the car contracting, and then when the contraction stopped, how you really, it's interesting how you are in so much pain during a contraction, and then you have this break and you feel kind of like a normal person again, and then the contractions happen. And throughout that car ride, those contractions were getting way more intense. So we end up getting to the hospital at 10 a.m. and we go to the triage room. Actually, Josh drops me off and he has to go park the car. And this was a scary moment for me, because I am being wheeled from the emergency room up into labor and delivery triage by myself, and I had all the bags, and I just remember being really scared in that moment. And at that moment is when I was like, okay, I don't want to be by myself. I want Josh next to me the entire time. And it felt like an eternity from him going to park the car. And so he goes and parks the car. I get to triage. They get me into the triage room, and while I'm in triage, they take my blood pressure while I'm contracting, and my blood pressure is 200 and something. I can't remember exactly. It was like 213 over 190 something. It was extremely scary high. I was in the middle of a contraction when she took that blood pressure, and the nurse said, we are not counting that blood pressure. We're going to redo it, and we are going to take blood pressure again. And she asked, has your blood pressure been high throughout this pregnancy? And it hadn't. My blood pressure typically and throughout the pregnancy is about 112 over 75. And when I was at the doctor's the day before, I remember it was a little bit elevated. It was 134 over 85, which is high for me, but it wasn't anything that my doctor was worried about. It wasn't anything that I was worried about. I just thought, oh, that's interesting that my blood pressure is higher than it typically is. So when the nurse took that first blood pressure, alarm bells went off, and they were thinking obviously preeclampsia. So she had me breathe. We decided, let's take another blood pressure, not during a contraction. And the second blood pressure was still in the severe range. I think it was, I can't remember, 170 over 110. So still severely high. And so at that point, she did a cervical check, and I was at 3 centimeters. And I don't know if they would have kept me technically if I was at 3 centimeters. Josh and I, at that point, I was in so much pain that we would have, during the contractions, that we would have probably just been like, no, we're staying. You're going to keep us here. We're going to figure it out. But at that point, because I had the high blood pressure, I was basically diagnosed with preeclampsia. In that moment, I was staying in the hospital, and that was that. The doctor came in, and she wanted to start me on magnesium, which is a medication, and high blood pressure medication. So we got on the high blood pressure medication right away. And the magnesium is something that I wanted to try to put off, if at all possible, because it makes you feel really, really sick. But it does help prevent seizures and strokes. It doesn't drop your blood pressure. The blood pressure medication is what's supposed to drop your blood pressure, but because blood pressure medications don't always work perfectly, they also want to put magnesium on top of that because it helps slow all the neurons in your brain, and so that you're less likely to have a seizure and or a stroke, which with blood pressure in those numbers, you do have the risk of having that. So we talked with the doctor, and we decided we're going to put off the magnesium until we have a urine sample from after the epidural is placed so that we can get a clean urine sample and see how much protein is in my urine so we can officially diagnose preeclampsia. The best way to officially diagnose preeclampsia is to know how much protein is in your urine, because preeclampsia can affect your kidneys and your liver. So with the amount of pain that I was in, even though I was only 3 centimeters dilated at that point, the doctor and the nurse had recommended me taking a little bit of fentanyl, which is a pain reliever, to help reduce my pain so that we could try to get some blood pressures with the pain level a little bit down, and then go ahead and start an epidural. So that fentanyl lasts for about an hour to an hour and a half, which was perfect timing. It helped me relax, it helped me to breathe, it helped me to get into the labor and delivery room, settled in, and then at noon, the anesthesiologist came in to do the epidural. And I was glad that the fentanyl was in my system when he was placing the epidural, because it allowed me to stay in a more comfortable or a still position for him. The epidural was an interesting experience. He had to try in 2 different spots. The first one did not work or did not take. I'm not exactly sure what was happening back there, but it was very difficult for him to get the epidural in, and he started on a lower spot, and then he had to go and do another epidural that was a little bit higher. And throughout that process, he ended up taking a phone call, and it was kind of an interesting experience, but the epidural worked. It worked really, really well. And at that point, I was out of pain. I was out of pain, and I was able to relax for the first time since basically 3 a.m. And the nurse was fantastic. I had a nurse, a labor and delivery nurse, and she had been working at this hospital for 23 or 4 years doing labor and delivery, and she was phenomenal. So once the epidural was placed, she got the catheter in, they sent off a urine sample. I was out of pain, I was resting, and we were waiting for the labs to come back on that urine sample to see how my kidneys were doing and to see if I was truly having preeclampsia. After the epidural was placed and we were waiting for the labs to come back, the nurse was feeling the whole time a ton, and she was feeling where baby was, and she knew that baby was a little bit on this side, and she wanted him, baby is a boy, she wanted baby Acre, to shift more down. And so she got me in this position with a peanut ball. She had me laying down, she had me resting, and she wanted me to relax for about an hour, let the epidural kick in, and she had me propped up in a specific way with a peanut ball to help baby drop down a little bit. At this point, our doula had arrived. It was Josh, this fantastic nurse, and our doula in the room. At around 3 o'clock is when the labs came back, and when you have your urine sample tested for protein, you want it at 0.3. My proteins in my urine were 6.3. So extremely, extremely high. So there was no question, no doubt, I had preeclampsia. I needed to get on magnesium. The reason that we wanted to put off magnesium is that it makes you feel very ill, and it's not a fun medication to be on. And once you are on it, once you deliver, you have to be on it for 24 hours after you deliver. So you're on it the whole time you're laboring, you deliver, and then you're on it for 24 hours after you deliver. And it makes you feel really sick. So at that point, everyone was on board. I needed to be on magnesium for the safety of me. As much as I didn't want to get on that medication, it was better than having a stroke or having a seizure. So at that point, the nurses come in really quick. We had already put the IV in, and they get the magnesium going. And because we had waited, when we got there, the doctor wanted to start the magnesium right away, and we had waited a few hours just to confirm that that's what I needed. She gave me a higher dose. So as soon as that magnesium started, I was pretty ill. I was a little disappointed because I had eaten a bunch in the morning, and then you got the epidural. And at our hospital, once you have an epidural, you are on a liquid diet. You can have gummies, you can have popsicles, you can have broth, you can have juice. Anything that's liquid has to be clear though. So a clear liquid diet. and I had scarfed down a protein bar right before the epidural. I had had breakfast. Oh, that was another thing. On the way to the hospital, Josh and I were talking, as before we had dropped the dogs off, we were like, let's go to Starbucks and let's get a coffee and a breakfast sandwich so that we have some energy. But the contractions on the way to the hospital had gotten so intense, we realized that was not a good idea. But anyway, that was kind of a funny side note. And I was thinking, as we were driving and the contractions were getting worse, I was like, the idea of smelling a breakfast sandwich sounds terrible right now, but I really wanted an iced tea. But anyway, so back to the magnesium. When I got on the magnesium, because they put me on such a high dose so quickly, I lost all of what I had eaten, and I was pretty disappointed about that because I felt like I really wanted that energy of the things that I had eaten in my system. After we got on the magnesium and I was ill, the nurse had gotten me in a couple other positions on the other side because she could still feel where baby was, and he was starting to shift and he was starting to come down, but she wanted me in a different position. So she put me in a different position, and then she had me rest again and kind of get my energy. And throughout that time, so we started the epidural at noon and we started the magnesium at 3. There were a couple different times where the nurse came in, and she was the most fantastic nurse. I thought in my head, I had this idea that as soon as you got an epidural, you were just going to be laying there in the bed the whole time. I did not realize that there is so much movement you can do with an epidural in the bed. I didn't get up out of bed as soon as the epidural was placed. I was in the bed the whole time, but my nurse had me moving so much. She had me on hands and knees. She had me on a ball, and she had me rotating my hips. She would hold onto my hips and rotate my hips, trying to get baby to move down. She had me up on the edge of the bed and swaying back and forth. There were 2 instances where she put me in this one position for about an hour where she wanted me to rest and sleep. But other than that, we were moving, swaying. At one point, she had me on all fours and she took a sheet wrapped around my hips and she was shaking, and she did that a bunch of times, and that felt so good. And my nurse was just so phenomenal. She was so great. I could feel my legs the whole time. I couldn't feel contractions. That was another thing. When you have an epidural, I couldn't feel contractions. Like, I was completely out of pain. There was no pain once the epidural hit, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful thing. So after we did all those moving and grooving and type things, she put me in another position where she could feel baby, and she wanted me, she had my leg up on a ball, and she wanted me to relax and rest for about an hour. At this point, we had a nurse shift change, and I got 2 nurses for the price of 1. And this was really awesome. These 2 nurses were really great too. One of them was a younger nurse who had been a nurse for a long time, but she was training to be a labor and delivery nurse. And so she had this really good young energy. She was so sweet and awesome. She didn't have as much experience as the nurse that was training her. And so I kind of got a really good nurse that had all this beautiful young energy. And then I had this other nurse with her that had a massive amount of experience, and we'll get to that when we actually do the delivery part. But there were now 2 nurses and Josh and the doula. And when the nurse before shift change had put me to rest, our doula, we had said, this is gonna be a while, you can go home and relax for a little bit. I'm still, I think we had done a cervical check at one point, I can't remember, and I was only at 5 centimeters. So we thought it was gonna be a while before anything really happened. And so we sent our doula home, and it was then just the 3 of us, the 2 nurses and Josh. And our plan was to have our doula to come back, but we never ended up needing her because we ended up having the 2 nurses that were fantastic, and it just felt like we didn't need an extra person in the room. I do not regret hiring a doula at all. She was awesome during the preparing for labor and delivery, but it just happened that we had such fantastic nurses that we didn't feel like in the moment that we needed to call her back. So at about 5:15, we had decided to go ahead and do some Pitocin. I was in no pain, and I thought, let's get this show on the road. I'm in no pain, the epidural's working. let's do some Pitocin. So I was all on board for it. They didn't even bring it up. I think I brought it up and I was like, can we get this show on the road? let's make things happen here. At about 6:30, the doctor comes in and we talk to the doctor, and she offers if I want my water to break, she'll break it for me because my water hadn't broke at that point. And again, I was all for it. I knew that if I had my water break, then maybe things would speed up. I wasn't in a hurry to get out of there, but I thought there's no reason for me to prolong this process if I don't have to, because this epidural's working. I feel fantastic. Let's get this show on the road. So at 6:30, the doctor breaks my water and I'm feeling really good. The nurses have me moving and grooving and we're doing all the things, shifting and feeling. Baby is starting to drop, feeling really good. At about 8 p.m., I'm getting really hungry. So I had a popsicle, and then they brought in some chicken broth. And I had 2 big cups of chicken broth. It probably was just chicken bouillon. I remember telling Josh, this is the best thing I've ever had. He tasted it and he's like, yeah, this is really good. Later he tells me that was very just generic broth, but I remember being like, wow, this chicken broth tastes fantastic. So I had 2 big cups of that. So from about 8:30 to 10 o'clock, they had me take another nap. They had positioned me with a peanut ball, put me in a position that they felt that would help baby continue to drop, and I took a solid 2-hour nap, which was fantastic. After that, they got me up again. We were up on all fours, moving, hips moving, swaying, getting me up on the bed, doing all the things, shaking my hips with that sheet, doing all the things. That was fantastic. That was, like I said, one thing that I had no idea that they did in hospitals to help babies drop, and it felt really good. At 12:30, every single time I had a contraction, they lost baby's heart rate. They couldn't, for some reason, however the monitor was working, they couldn't track baby's heart rate at all. And so it was making the doctor very, very nervous. And at this point, my contractions are about every 2 minutes to 3 minutes apart, and they look really intense when you're watching the contraction monitor. That was another thing that was kind of cool, is being able to watch that contraction monitor and feeling no pain as I was watching that contraction monitor. So at 12:30, the doctor came in and she really wanted to put a fetal monitor on baby's head. So they go up through you and they attach a monitor onto baby's head so they can track his heart rate, because they were not able to track his heart rate. Every single time I had a contraction, for some reason, they couldn't track his heart rate. That was something I really didn't want to have happen, but for the safety of baby, we thought, you know what, let's go ahead and do it. And so the doctor went in there and she attached the monitor onto baby's head. And at that point, that was the 3rd cervical check since I went into the hospital, and I was completely ready to deliver the baby. I was at 10 centimeters, fully effaced. He was down. I don't know all the things. I just know that at that point, the doctor said, you can push. And I got terrified at that moment. I remember looking at Josh. And up until this point, I felt really, really good. I felt confident. I loved the nurses that I had. Josh was being incredibly supportive, and it just was really scary. The idea of pushing was the scary part for me, because I hear these stories where it can take 2 to 4 hours, and then a lot of people end up in C-sections, and then you have the hard part of going through all the labor, which up until that point had felt super, super doable and manageable. And so I just remember getting very, very scared. But Josh was super awesome, and he was like, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. And validated my feelings. And I really thought that I wanted to try to push on my hands and knees up on the edge of the bed, with my hands up on the edge of the bed. And one of the nurses offered to place her fingers and feel the contraction as it was happening, and we would do a couple practice pushes so that she could kind of coach me and tell me how, you know, if I was having productive pushing, because it's hard to know what to do when you've never done it before. And so at 1 a.m. we did a couple practice pushes. I think we did 3 with 3 different contractions, but my back was seizing so bad, and my shoulders, I told the nurse, I said, as I'm pushing, I'm not focusing on actually pushing, I'm focusing on not having my back seize. So the doctor came back in and she said, let's do this. Let's give you some Tylenol. Let's put some heat packs on your back. We're gonna let the Tylenol kick in for about 30 minutes. We're gonna let the heat pack relax those shoulder muscles. And then we're gonna come back and we're gonna push. So as we were waiting for those 30 minutes, they got all the doctor-y things set up. Oh, and when my water broke, there was meconium in the amniotic fluid. So as we were waiting, they had some baby nurses come in. I'm not exactly sure what they were, just in case when the baby came out, if he had swallowed any meconium, then they could take care of him. And they got everything set up while we were letting my back and shoulders relax with that Tylenol. And at that point too, I could start feeling the contractions again, which was good. I wanted to be able to feel the contractions, but I could feel them a little too much. So before we started the actual pushing session or the delivery of the baby, we had the anesthesiologist come in and he upped the dose of the epidural a little bit so that we would be able to push the baby out comfortably. I told him I didn't want to be able to not feel anything. I wanted to be able to still feel the contractions, but I didn't want any of the pain associated because I was starting to get pain back again. So those 30 minutes elapsed, epidural kicked in, Tylenol kicked in, heat packs kicked in, and the very seasoned nurse, she came and she told me, she's like, Becky, we are gonna get this baby out. I have great confidence that I know exactly which position to put you in. And at that point, I was like, I will do whatever you want me to do. I'm gonna listen to you. You have more experience than I do. I will get in any position. I, for some reason, did not want to deliver him on my back. I don't know, I'd seen a bunch of reels of people saying, you don't have to deliver babies on your back if you don't want to. And so in my mind, I was thinking, it's not as good to deliver on your back. But this nurse, she was so confident. She told me exactly which position to get in, which was on my back. And she told me what exactly to do. I did exactly what she did with one push, one contraction, and his head was basically out at that point. So in one push, we had baby A was almost delivered. And she then said, whoa, 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 we need to get the doctor in here and we're gonna deliver this baby probably in the next contraction. So the doctor rushes in, they have all the nurses for baby. I reach down and I can feel baby's head. I remember saying, he feels so little. And then the doctor's there within the next contraction, one big push and he's out. And that was it. They put baby on my chest and we have a little baby boy. So they put him on my chest, and in our hospital, I had said I wanted delayed cord clamping. That's kind of standard in our hospital. So by 1:50, he was delivered. Josh was able to cut the cord. Josh had noticed that while he was on my chest that he was breathing a little bit funny. He didn't swallow any meconium, but they could tell that there was like some mucousy stuff in his sinuses. So they did take him off me after they cut the cord. They got him all cleaned up. They didn't bathe him or anything. They just got all that gunk so that he could breathe a little bit better out of his sinuses and lungs and whatever, I don't know, but he was doing great. He was on the small side. He's only 6 pounds, so when he was born. And so he was a little bit cold. So they wanted to get him back on my chest with a warm blanket on me. And we were able to snuggle and have that golden hour that they call it with skin to skin. I did tear a little bit. So and I did hemorrhage, which I didn't even realize that I had hemorrhaged till later. I lost about 1.7 liters of blood, but the doctor, she took care of it. She got me stitched up. I had a 2-degree tear, and they then weighed him, measured him. He was completely healthy other than the fact that he was on the small side, and that could be due to the fact of the preeclampsia. My doctor thinks that that's something that just spontaneously happened, but I also think that maybe it's something that could have been happening for a while. I did have if you remember, we had a 38-week ultrasound, and at that 38-week ultrasound, he was measuring 6.7 pounds, and he was in the 64th percentile. When he was born, he was 6 pounds even, and he was in the 3rd percentile. So I'm thinking, I don't know, that the preeclampsia may have started about 2 weeks before. I had had some swelling in my feet. I thought it was due to all the cooking and filming and everything that I had been doing. And I didn't even talk to my OB about it because I just assumed it was normal swelling. But at this point, I kind of been thinking that the preeclampsia had started a little bit sooner and that he hadn't really been growing during those last 2 weeks. I don't know. It doesn't matter. He's healthy, totally fine. At this point, the pediatricians are not worried about his weight or anything. It's just he's, you know, gaining weight and doing all the things. And normally it's just a matter of that he's just a little baby. And I always wanted a little baby, and I really like that he's a little baby. So we have a little baby. And my friend put it perfectly. She said, the fact that you have a little baby means that you get to have a little baby longer because it'll take longer for him to grow. So that is the labor and delivery story. It does get a little bit more intense and a little bit crazier. I remember telling Josh after the birth that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I think that I had very little expectations, and my expectations were probably the worst of the worst. And so the fact that it went as well as it did, and that there was as little pain as there was, I mean, there was a lot of pain before the epidural, but once the epidural kicked in, I was so pleasantly surprised and blown away how little pain and discomfort there is, at least in my experience, with the labor and the delivery. And the fact that I didn't push for very long, all of that added up to, for me, a very positive labor and delivery story. I was totally happy, even though I was on the magnesium, which was awful. I guess I didn't really talk about that anymore after. Once I got sick, then they reduced the amount of magnesium I was on, and you just kind of feel crummy, but it wasn't like the worst thing in the world. It wasn't fun, but it wasn't horrible after that initial sickness that I had. But I did have to be on magnesium. So he was born at 150. I still had to be on the magnesium for another 24 hours. There's a lot more to this story. So this is part 1, labor and delivery. Part 2 is going to be a postpartum story and a rehospitalization story. This story is just beginning and we've got a lot more to tell. So if you are new, please consider subscribing if you are interested in all, because I am also going to be doing a premiere for the postpartum and rehospitalization. So we can be in the live chat together, hanging out, and just being together during this story. One of the things that I was the most worried about also was the postpartum and the healing process of labor and delivery. There's a lot I feel like is not really talked about, and after going through all of it, I am totally open and willing to talk about some of these things that I just don't feel like we talk about. You know, the fact that we're wearing a diaper along with our newborn babies. It's not super glamorous. The healing, the emotions that go along with all of this. And so if you're interested, I would greatly appreciate it if you decide to hang out around, and I am excited to share part 2 with you. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, I can post a couple of my other videos right here if you can enjoy between now and my next upload, and I can't wait to see you next time.